Anyway, welcome to Newcomen Midlands, to our March lecture. Just before I introduce our speaker, the reason I'm chairing the meeting is because Jim is giving the lecture, and it seemed a bit hard to ask him to both chair the meeting and give the lecture. So anyway, before I introduce him, just a couple of safety things. We'll shut the external doors in a few minutes, but you can always escape by pressing the green button to temporarily release them if you need to leave early or anything. If there's any kind of actual emergency, then there'll be a lady will come on the tannoy and sort of give us a kind of pre-warning, and then if we actually have to evacuate, a male voice will come on the tannoy and give us instructions to evacuate. Basically, it's out the way you came in, or if for some reason that is impassable, then there's another way out up at the top corner up there. So, so I will now happily introduce our speaker, Dr. Jim Andrew. He has been involved in the Midlands Branch here for decades, many decades of which he was the secretary, the branch secretary, and still has a lot of involvement because he has access to this building and as a consultant to the museum, so he acts as our liaison officer. Anyway, he quite early in his career he worked for the BSA company, and I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit about that, but that's given him an interest in it. And so when he started to find some documentation about how the BSA factory survived attacks from the Luftwaffe in the Second World War, he thought it would make an interesting talk. So, Dr. Andrew.
Thank you. All right. I joined BSA with engineering degrees from the University of London in 1966 and soon heard about the air raids on the works during the Second World War and how they recovered to full production in a remarkably short time. An epic story. I obtained my professional engineering qualifications with BSA, but then as the contractions were going on in the industry, I left BSA as their chief standards engineer in 1973. I managed to join Birmingham City Council as a noise and air pollution inspector. More money and a right fudge of an interview. I never had a proper interview for any job I was involved in, but don't tell everybody outside because you're not supposed to do that sort of thing these days. I joined them as a noise and air pollution inspector. Because as a standards engineer dealing with vehicle legislation, I've been making submissions to governments on why it was a bit of silly asking for seat belts on motorbikes, for example. That was one of the favourites. And in the process, got to know quite a bit about the environment and other environmental matters. I managed to re-qualify and have been working there for a while when I saw a job advertised at Birmingham Science Museum. And I was appointed Keeper of Science in 1974. Another qualification in 1979, and finally a PhD in 1991, based on my research on Boulton and Watt steam engines. So, let's move on to the subject of this talk. My main source is this book, published in 1946, under the then rigorous post-war restrictions on paper quality, hence the poor quality of the images which I shall be inflicting on you later on. But they were a very good source of quite a detailed picture. The BSA, I knew, were very good at self-publicity, and I was a little worried drawing on anything that they produced. And this book was published in 1946. However, by looking at it very carefully and knowing a good deal about other bits of the story, I think what I've extracted is a fairly accurate story of their actions in the Second World War. Birmingham arms trade grew from weapons manufacture probably in the 1500s and certainly became a major industry in Birmingham during the 1600s. Many firms were still quite small and very much craft-based, but they combined together to satisfy large government contracts, as mentioned in this letter from 1690. In 1851, there was the exhibition at the Crystal Palace in London, the International Exhibition, and this brought an awareness to British companies of manufacturing methods being adopted throughout the industrial world, and that included quite a bit of detail of the USA's manufacture, particularly using machine manufacture of components and moves towards interchangeability of components. And this seemed a good thing to follow. So this display in the 1862 International Exhibition was showing the state of Birmingham's trade just as the major firms decided to come together and set up a new company, the Birmingham Small Arms Company, to adopt, amongst other things, to adopt the American system of manufacture. Sorry, just getting the logistics sorted out. The company bought 25 acres in Small Heath, adjacent to the canal, and erected a new factory, which would soon be in production and able to complete large orders of firearms for governments around the world. The first work in the UK was the conversion of 100,000 muzzle-loading rifles into breech loaders using a system developed by the Schneider Company. And this consisted of chopping a chunk out of the top of the breech of a muzzle-loading gun, putting in a block that pivoted on the far side, containing firing pin and so on, so a cartridge could be loaded, and then the firing pin would be clouted by the hammer in the usual, as it would have operated onto a percussion cap in the past, and fire the thing. So 100,000 of them was quite a large order, and this took some time to complete, but it did give the British Army a much more modern weapon very rapidly and without the cost of all the other bits of barrels and timber and so on. The new firm could certainly handle large orders and had orders from around the world, from military arms trade, but the military arms trade was also very regular, and the firm could make use of their growing experience and expertise in accurate component manufacture by supplying parts to other trades. And one of the early ones they got involved with was the bicycle trade, sometimes producing weapons themselves, like this rather curious Otto cycle with two large wheels side by side. Quite popular apparently for a while. This was in the days, of course, before the safety bicycle with gearing and smaller wheels. So the wheels were big as they were on penny farthings, but this at least kept your centre of gravity rather lower than sitting on top of a big wheeler. The firm later moved into making complete safety cycles, and then into motorcycles and eventually motor cars and a whole range of other manufacturers. Obviously, the standard British Army rifle was developing very rapidly during the late 19th century, and BSA supplied quite a number of different weapons through each stage before the Army really settled on the .303 inch Lee Enfield, which was introduced about 1900. certainly in the collections, we've got ones from only a few years after that, which remained with the BSA company and came down to it. Bear in mind, it's a magazine. Whoops, I think I've goofed it. There's a magazine which held 5 rounds plus one up the spout, as they put it. The magazine could be changed very rapidly. High rate of fire could be achieved, and skilled soldiers could achieve a rate of fire with a group of them firing that could lead the enemy to imagine they'd actually got machine guns. They were that fast in the initial very well trained army that went to France in 1914. The Lee Enfield in various models was produced right through the First and the Second World Wars, and all using the same ammunition. So until you had a careful look at the date stamped on them, you weren't always entirely sure when your particular rifle was made. Over 1.5 million Lee Enfield rifles were supplied during the First World War. And it's presumed that many of these were actually returned to stores at the end of the war, reconditioned, put into stores, waiting for the next war. The rifle production section was mothballed until the rearming in the 1930s. And a number of the other products, of course, also suffered from the fact that there was an awful lot of army surplus stuff. So the firm really did fall on hard times at the end of the First World War. But going back a bit to just before the war, when an American, Colonel I.N. Lewis, approached the company and showed them his Lewis machine gun. This has a magazine on the top there which held 47 rounds. It was possible to have a double-sized magazine with 94 rounds, and those at various times were used, they were particularly used on aircraft. High rate of fire, a light machine gun, and it was adopted as a .303 weapon for the British Army, and BSA made, somewhere I have a note of it, 145,000 of them during the First World War. The Americans also produced them, and they produced ones in .300 rimless cartridges, as opposed to the rimmed .303 cartridges. And if you want to look at them later, there's a .303 cartridge and a .300 American one down there, just to compare them. They simply would not operate in each other in the other weapon. They had to get the right ammunition. So, production ceased, of course, at the end of the First World War of the aircrafts and the machine guns. And the machine gun plant was mothballed, expecting to bring it back into use if there was a further conflict. I can't find any sign of these Lewis machine guns being produced in large quantities during the Second World War, but you will see plenty of evidence of them being used in the Second World War. In particular, things like Home Guard units, and my father's Home Guard unit, for example, they were equipped with the American .300 Lewis gun. But the British services had adopted the Bren gun, machine gun, as the new standard. And BSA made quite numbers of Bren guns or Bren gun parts. With that, BSA also produced their own BSA machine gun, which used a slightly curious caliber. I think it was intended that it could be used with foreign ammunition. And that was a gun which could be vehicle mounted in armoured cars and as aiming machine gun for tanks. Here we have a shot from 1917 of the Enfield rifles being carried by the troops, and a Lewis machine gun there set on the top of a post as an anti-aircraft gun. And they were used in battles throughout the First World War. King George V visited many factories during the First World War and is seen here at the Armoury Road works of Small Heath with the chairman and the general manager. Then, of course, at the end of the war, many of the existing government contracts were immediately cut back, as well as not having other government contracts coming through. Many workers were made redundant. The company immediately sought to expand cycle and motorcycle manufacture, but they were competing with ex-military equipment that was being sold off as surplus. New products were being sought to use the factory space now available and to re-employ those workers, the skilled workers who had been discharged. In due course, components were made for emerging industries like domestic wireless and other items for the home. Motorcycle production restarted with smaller BSA 3- and 4-wheel sports cars with front-wheel drive. This shows the Armoury Road works. Right, now, this was the main works between the wars. Up there is that original building from the 1860s, and you can see how much the plant has expanded. Down Armoury Road here with blocks both sides. Then, of course, a lot of dwellings here, which we'll come back to in due course. One particular building, the 1915 building, was this 200-yard long, 4-story, 3 separate bays, production workshops. And this was the major building on site. My office for a while was above the canal over there somewhere. Very cold it is in an office above the canal. I was even nearly got in trouble when the manager rang, and of course I couldn't answer the phone because I was wearing everything, including my crash helmet. I just knocked the thing over and said, "I'm sorry, it's too cold in here to do anything like answering the phone." And he came up and brought some electric fires in next to no time, so it worked out all right in the end. The rifle plant, having remained idle until about 1935, was then put back into operation, as not only was it realised that rearmament was starting to come along, but the management had made a number of trips to Germany in the late 30s and had seen what was going on. And they came back from a certain number of discussions over there without getting locked up as spies to say, we're going to be forced into a war. And the company committed funds to prepare for war production. So BSA also tooled up to produce the 303 machine guns, which armed the fighters and bombers of the RAF as production of the aircraft industry expanded. Bear in mind that the standard RAF fighter could carry 6 or 8 machine guns, and as turret bombers came in, carrying 2 machine guns in the front and the upper turret, and 4 machine guns in the tail turret. So that's a lot of machine guns. It was also obvious to the company, and indeed to industry in general, that there were serious problems about the location of a lot of factories. The experience of the bombing raids in the Spanish Civil War really made them understand that they did need to move to less congested sites away from other industry. This was a large plant which was constructed at Redditch, and I worked there for a while, and again, down in this little unit here, it had very much contracted by the middle 1960s when I was there, but you could see it as a big factory and had enormous amount of production activity there. Another factory was in Shirley, given over straight away to gun production as government orders started to come in for rearming the services. In April 1940, there was a royal visit by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, just as the threats to the UK were growing, and shortly before the Dunkirk evacuation brought the threat much nearer to the UK. No doubt the royal visitors would have seen the works to expand gun production for the Army, for the RAF and the Navy to match the expansions going on. There were also other military products closely allied to peacetime production, such as cycles and motorcycles, an amazing number of cycles and motorcycles that the services required, and they were definitely put onto a World War footing. Here we have a line of motorcycles, military versions. They'd been supplied by BSA on and off since the First World War in small numbers, but now production was ratcheted up to replace civilian production of motorcycles. They also went into producing more of the folding bicycles for squaddies and eventually modified for airborne use. And the motoring sections, of course, moved in more and more into military vehicles. These are some of the illustrations which I'm afraid are a bit poor. But anyway, this is a Browning 303 machine gun, equipped many fighters and bombers in the early years of the war, and was much increased as the air war started. And this uses a belt of ammunition drawn in there, and there is a short section down here of belted 303 cartridge cases, just to give an idea of what that was like. High rate of fire of these weapons when used in the air did lead to quite serious wear on the barrel, and that of course affected accuracy. So the firm was not only producing large numbers of complete guns, but spare barrels, and eventually rebuilding worn-out guns in a special section of the factory. The production of the Browning machine guns reached something like 3,000 a month as the UK moved towards the Battle of Britain, but it was obviously expected much higher as the firm and its outposts geared up for larger and larger scale manufacture. By the start of the Battle of Britain, machine gun availability for the RAF really was critical, and sometimes there were RAF transports apparently queuing to collect replacements as soon as they cleared inspection at the factory. Since their visit to Germany before the war, the management knew that there would be attempts to halt production by bombing. The Germans have been taking aerial photographs of factories around the UK with photo reconnaissance equipment built into airliners, and these are modified from the ones of the BSA works, marking up the areas affected by bombing in 1940. Unfortunately, the Germans had far less information about the shadow factories, and they received much less attention. Indeed, after November 1940, the Germans may have thought that they had completely destroyed the Small Heath plant, as they made few further visits. Bear in mind, though, there was also a UK policy which was to exaggerate reports of the damage caused by raids in newspaper reports and on the radio, because that would reduce the Germans' interest in revisiting those particular plants. The first air raid was in August 1940. It resulted in the destruction or damage of 750 machine tools, before the raids in November added 1,600 to the number destroyed or damaged. This painting in the Museum and Art Gallery shows the aftermath of the 19th of November raid, when fire appliances and men were drawn from all over the Midlands to extinguish the fires and to rescue the considerable number of employees who were trapped. As you can see, particularly the four-storey building here, this had collapsed into a terrible heap of tangled, with workers trapped inside it, because although many of them would have gone to air raid shelters, it depended on how soon they could stop their operations as bombers approached and get to the air raid shelters, or even whether in some cases the shelters were close enough to the buildings to be themselves buried in the debris. And there are some quite epic tales of folks who were injured and who were rescued from under the rubble. A few days later, much of the main building had been cleared of debris and in due course was rebuilt, but there was one section which was cleared and left. That was the section that I think there was no definite certainty that, not that there were no casualties alive under the rubble, but they couldn't be absolutely sure that they got all the dead out. And certainly there was a feeling that there may well have been folks still buried under the concrete when they were just cemented over. Sad. During the Second World War, 53 employees were killed by enemy action. Most of these were on the night of the 19th of November. There were a similar number of badly injured casualties, and then others were lesser injuries. 9 of these casualties were women. Although this was during the night shift, the regulations which had existed for a long time, which ruled out night work for women, had been relaxed at the beginning of the Second World War. And so there were a number of women were also amongst the casualties. Also have to remember the many injured during these raids, and indeed the emergency workers who were coming in trying to search for survivors in dangerous conditions, and while the raids were still continuing. Something in parallel with this is that at this time the works canteens now worked 24/7 to ensure that workers, particularly those whose homes were damaged, were assured of hot meals in the works, or even as they arrived in the works in the morning, that there would be food for them. There was tremendous bravery shown during and after the November raid, and the following medals were awarded. There was a George Medal to Albert Bailey and to Alfred Stevens. British Empire Medal to John Beattie, Alfred Goodwin, Arthur Harris, William Sagerin, Albert Slynn, and Joseph Topham. And an MBE to Miss Ada Deeming, who was the matron of the works medical units. And a further 5 were officially commended for their actions on that night. The King made further visits to the plant within days, and in fact had a fortunate escape. Obviously the plant had been checked before anybody was going to let the King anywhere near it, but a few hours after he'd left, a delayed action bomb exploded, and then realised what had happened was this bomb had come down into the coal store, and as it disappeared into the heaps of coal, they just flowed back into the hole afterwards, and there was no visible sign that there was a bomb down there. So it went bang. Fortunately, there were no serious casualties, Well, there were lumps of coal apparently raining down over quite an area as the bomb went off. There's no record of the efforts made by people to gather up the coal. This graph shows the impact from the November raids on the machine gun production. You can see here it drops. There were subcontract and shadow factories already into production, and they were managing to produce still, where are we, 2,500 guns a month, but it took 3 months to get back to the line of steadily increasing production. And of course, eventually it gets up to this figure here, regularly continuing at 12 to 15,000 a month. Fortunately, subcontract and shadow factory production could help with this, but it was also a need for a major effort to repair the damaged machine tools. Fortunately, many of the machines were both robust and numbers of them are identical design. So having got them out and cleaned them up, it was then possible to swap components and to rebuild to produce a smaller number of machines that were in good condition. Much effort was devoted to outsourcing manufacture to other factories. Noted that by 1942, BSA's production of machine tools reached 16,000 a month. This is one of the many chalkboards that were put up around the works, updated daily so that staff could see their contribution to defending the country and the number of weapons being produced. Every day staff could see efforts to reinstate production by replacing damaged machines. The government had already established a central register of machines which could be requisitioned to keep production going. They were also identifying factory premises which could be requisitioned for displaced workers and production machines. And there's rather splendid accounts of the gang standing by whilst the last of a batch of non-strategic materials products were being finished, so that those machines could then be reeved out of the way and the production machinery for weapons to be moved in to take over that plant. A local office for all this activity of relocating factories and finding kit was in central Birmingham, in Great Charles Street. And one of their engineers was LTC Rolt, the engineering historian. And he mentions his work on that sort of activity in his autobiographies. Don't try and read the small detail, I just want to show, here we've got the factories into which BSA stuff was moved, from Stoke-on-Trent in the north down to Ruislip in the south. I've got enlargements of that for a moment. Many of these units were producing components which could then be taken to larger plants for assembly. You must remember that BSA produced not only a range of guns up to 20mm calibre, but some larger ones, motorcycles, cars, including Daimlers, who made armoured cars in the First World War and went on into the Second World War making armoured cars, and various other ones. Royal visits continued, and some interesting ones. This is a very poor print, I'm afraid. This is Queen Mary, the King's mother, visiting Corsham in Wiltshire, which was actually an underground factory. And the royal family did spend a fair amount of their time, it seems, wandering around on official visits to production, wartime production machinery, and no doubt encouraging people and morale in the area. It's not recorded whether they visited any of the place where there had been riots from people who didn't want to work for the UK government, it seemed. Right, let's go back to those details of the factories to which things were distributed. There's no detail of just what Small Heath was still producing, but you'll see a whole range of the weapons there and the dates at which they were brought into production. So at Shirley you've got number 4 and number 5 rifles coming in, the Browning machine guns, all Browning machine guns. The BSA, that was their own machine gun for armoured weapons, for armoured vehicles. The Hispano, which was the aircraft 20mm cannon, and the Oerlikon, which was a 20mm land use cannon or naval use. They came with a magazine or clip loaded, whereas the Hispano used belts of 20mm ammunition. There's a 20mm, that's a dummy, down here with a couple of the sections of the chain, of the clips used to produce these belts of ammunition to be used in the machine guns, and also a similar small section of belt for the 303. Oh, excuse me, moving back a bit. The 2-pounder was the small anti-tank gun, which was adopted by the Army in 1941. And you get firms like Monochrome, which produce high quality chromed components. So quite a mixture. And that underground factory was down here at Corsham on Hispano Suiza cannons. We move to the north. We've got, right up the top here, Mansfield, the boys' anti-tank rifles being produced, and components for brain guns, various projectiles, fuses, more cannons, rocket projectiles down at Stafford. Rocket projectiles were the things that went onto aircraft. You've seen lots of shots of them diving down to attack locomotives and tanks and vehicles with 2 rockets firing off. I don't know what happened if one side didn't fire, because I get the feeling that they must have made quite a load on the airframe as they went off. I put an illustration here of the boys' anti-tank rifle, because while the 303 service rifles and these larger cannon and so on are fairly well known, but the anti-tank rifle, the boys' rifle, is not so well known. It was very much a stopgap, the anti-tank weapon. It wasn't very good against tanks. It would certainly be reasonable against some of the early armoured vehicles and for dealing with transport. It fired a .55 caliber projectile. It might just at that size have been explosive, but nonetheless they were quite small. I have fired many 303 rifles when I used to do target shooting. And they do have a fearsome kick, somewhat likened to the kick of a mule. I have a feeling that a boy's rifle probably produced a kick more like that of a Shire horse, and really would be quite a painful item to operate with. Obviously it's got a long barrel and therefore it can accelerate for further to get muzzle velocity, but even then. Right. The Hispano Suiza 20mm cannon, introduced in 1941, used in fighters in place of eventually of Browning 303 machine guns. Later half-inch Browning machine guns, mostly from America, I think probably, were used in the turrets of bombers when larger gun turrets were adopted. Half-inch Browning machine guns were probably American manufacture, but such was the wear of these things that BSA provided spares and rebuilds, both for the RAF and for the American Air Forces, as they took the bombing further and further into Europe. The museum Spitfire has two 20mm cannon. It's also got machine guns in each wing, and it could carry bombs underneath. So quite a potent weapon. But of course, the problem with the 20mm cannon is that it's a lot larger and the ammunition is a lot larger, and so you have far fewer rounds available to fire. So you can't do much, you can't really fire bursts of cannon. You've got to be a bit more careful with the stock of them. The BSA, sorry, even though the cannon would be rather difficult to operate outside the aircraft, it doesn't even have a magazine because they were built into the aircraft structure. But nonetheless, we were asked to fit dummies in the Spitfire as it stood on the floor in the old museum, lest the public and the media might have thrown a wobbly that such destructive weapons not being in a secure store. It would be even more so today. I think these days, with the woke effect that's going on at the moment, even pea shooters have to be shot, be stored somewhere. Here we have the graph of production of those Hispano-Suiza cannon. Starting in 1941, it reached 1,700 a week in the BSA group. I've no idea why you've got a couple of single months or periods where production drops way back. I don't know whether that was simply the result of their scheduling of production. It certainly wasn't the effect of enemy air raids. The last one in Birmingham was in 1943. The Oerlikon was this other sort of 20mm cannon with a magazine or clip fired, because this was for anti-aircraft and for shipboard use. So magazines would be changed, which obviously wasn't possible for fighter aircraft or even for the gun turrets of the RAF bombers. This came into production in 1941 at Ruislip and St Albans factories. We've got a rather nice production shop shown shortly. Some of those factories will be making the components which will then be assembled elsewhere. This is the assembly, possibly at the Small Heath plant, or it may have been down at Ruislip, of Oerlikon cannons being assembled and then checked out and inspections and so on. And no doubt some research will clarify just where this lot was going on. It remained above production remained above 1,000 a week for a couple of months. Sorry, 1,000 a month for a couple of years in the middle of the war, which is quite an achievement, I think. And here we have the Sten gun. Many other guns were made by BSA, including the Sten gun, which some people rather disparagingly call the gas pipe gun. They were very, very much the ultimate in utility design. My father, who had dealings with some of these as a factory manager, so the best of the weapons were possibly those which had been based at factories which had machine shop facilities and a home guard unit. Because they could at least machine and take off the burrs and the welding sputter, which on Sten guns used to produce misfires. They really were in some ways quite dangerous for those using them. Sorry about the cough. Unless you put the safety gun position, the gun would simply fire if you banged it down. And the easiest way of banging down with one of these, particularly, you know, if you've got it all primed and everything ready to go, was if you jumped off a truck and it went donk, or if you jumped over obstacles on a exercise, never mind in a real battle. And the danger was the way you tended to hold the thing, if it did shoot, it would go straight up through your right shoulder. Nasty. So they were a gun that maybe frightened our own side nearly as much as it should have frightened the Germans. The BSA, the BSA machine gun used rimless cartridges of 7.9mm caliber, which is really a continental type of ammunition, and maybe with a view to them being able to use captured ammunition. I don't know. They were often fitted in armoured vehicles, either to deal with targets where the main gun would have been overkill, or as an aiming weapon for the main gun. So, something a bit unusual there. Bicycles. BSA had made folding cycles in the First World War. The idea with that was that you could actually mount them onto a soldier's backpack, and that would leave his two hands free to carry on fighting. Initially, many were produced for the infantry in the Second World War. Bear in mind, at the beginning of the Second World War, most of the armies involved in the Second World War were crucially short of any means of moving large numbers of troops. And for moving heavier things, there were many of them using horsepower. And so, for a while, providing squaddies with cycles, also large quantities of cycles for the Navy and the RAF. Eventually, a lightweight version was developed for the airborne forces. They managed to get the weight down to about 26 pounds for a fully equipped paratroopers bicycle. There remains some controversy, though, as to whether the best way of dropping them, like other bits of stuff that the parachutists carried, as they came out of the aircraft, they got all sorts of things which dangled on webbing below them. Partly, I think the idea was that if a lot of the weight was down there, then momentarily, as the load touched the floor, it would slightly reduce the speed of the poor squaddie coming down as he went down to land. But controversy continues to whether they were dangled so that they landed on the handlebars or on the wheels. And I think probably I would have rather faced with a slightly mangled handlebars on a bicycle than one with buckled wheels. But they made large numbers of these. One does wonder just how many of them went into action. There are certainly tales of large numbers of folding bicycles being abandoned at the roadside by squaddies who would rather run for their lives than try and bicycle. The motoring bits of BSA were involved in things like the light armoured car, although I don't think these were terribly well armoured from the look of it. And then large numbers of guns of all types went back for repair. The rate of fire of these half-inch Browning machine guns in the British and American bombing offensives over Europe meant that you got a lot of worn guns, and they set up a section which would recondition guns sent back to the factory. Moving to production equipment that was used, and all of this is stuff which of course had to be relocated as a result of those bombing raids or as a result of moving production out from factories which were at great risk. So, heat treatment, the BSA group, many components were heat treated to harden them after machining. This is the furnaces being used to harden the BSA machine gun breech blocks to reduce their rate of wear when they were being fired. Tempering of gun barrels after machining. The firm's technician developed this vertical furnace to reduce stresses. It's much better if something which is tubular and straight is dangled from one end rather than being able to slump a bit whilst it's being heat treated. The Hispano-Suiza barrels were broached to reduce the stages of manufacture. Broaching is where you have, having got a hole in a component, you have a very long tool with increasing size of teeth all the way down the length of this thing, and you shove that tool right through to form exactly the profile of the components you're after. And at the Redditch plant, when I was there, the company still had a large number of broaching machines, and they were actually operating a system where companies with components needing broaching, rather than installing the machine themselves, would bring the broaching tool that they'd had made and the stack of components to Redditch Works, and they would set up and put the batch through for them. And then you've got other things which very often don't get mentioned, like brass fuses had to be stamped with identification marks. Quite an important task. If you don't get it right, then somebody is going to have a terrible mistake in using fuses in action. This is the Oerlikon, one of the production shops at the Ruislip factory. And here you can see, in this case, it's got blast walls all the way down the length of this immensely long shop to reduce the blast damage from any raids. Fortunately, it doesn't seem that the Ruislip attracted much attention that way, but they were definitely fitted up to deal with it. Lots of bits and pieces had to be cleaned up in production. Very easy to get to have burrs from machining, which have to be very carefully taken off so as not to disturb the dimensions. Then we've got a young girl welding, one of the many young pupils employed by the firm, and also a lad here working a lathe. There was a scheme for pupils to leave school before school leaving age if it meant that they would then being trained for a future career in machining. And maybe doing the real job was much better for them and gave them much better training than a similar operation in a school workshop. Anybody and everybody who wanted to pull their weight would become involved, and jobs could be found for many people, disabled people included. Here's a blind woman inspecting screw threads on components, using suitable gauges, and that as a task could be adapted to allow disabled workers to pull their weight in the factory, which is very good. Women made many contributions. When the factory suffered air raids, there were casualties to be treated in sick bays and shelters. These women formed one of the fire teams using small fire pumps. The factory was alongside the canal, but there were also static water tanks around the factory which were topped up so that these small fire pumps could draw on them and get into action as quickly as possible. This is an Indian worker busy cutting rifle barrels to length before they were further machined. It's awfully easy to forget that there were large numbers of people who'd come over from the Indian subcontinent well before World War II, settled in the UK, and the impression is so given that it was the immigration after the Second World War that was the first large-scale immigration. It wasn't. Lots of us stuff earlier, in many cases going back years and years. So this is just one of the companies employing workers who, between them, overall produced possibly, this may be BSA over-egging it a bit, half the UK's production of guns up to 20mm during the war. And here is the list of those weapons. 1.25 million Lee Enfield rifles, 400,000 Sten guns and Browning machine guns, smaller numbers obviously of 20mm cannon, but still totally over 80,000. These are machine guns going for nearly 60,000. The BSA also, I was surprised at this, it was actually produced as a 15mm as well, which must have been naughty, but only a small number. And then 68,000 of those boys' anti-tank rifles. This just gives a comparison between the size of the cartridge at the bottom there, which is actually a Mazak dummy used for training purposes, and a 303 machine gun. There had to be a balance struck really between the damage done by the weight of the projectiles and the weight of the rounds being carried in an aircraft. These and samples of the belted ammunition are on the table at the front if you want to look at it later. This has been quite a story of the effort to maintain production despite the air raids, but we must never forget the sacrifice of staff and emergency workers after those raids. When raids were thought to be on their way, works were warned and placed on standby, but they remained at work. There were warnings as raids moved closer. Then they were told to stop working before going to the air raid shelters. Sadly, some shelters were hit, and sometimes air raids progressed too quickly for normal evacuation. You can see how close houses were here and across the far side of the railway there, close they were to the factory. And of course this meant that there were lots of casualties among the local residents, including the families of staff who were on duty at the works. Civilians killed by enemy action were reported to the council, and a book was published after the war showing all those who'd lost their lives in the Blitz on Birmingham. Some years ago, this memorial was erected close to the markets and St Martin's Church in the Bullring. It gives details of 77 actual raids and 365 air raid alerts during the war. The total of Birmingham civilians killed in these bombings was 2,241, with 7,647 injured between the 8th of August 1940 and the 23rd of April 1943, which was the date of the last raid on Birmingham. All the names of those killed in alphabetical order are recorded on this memorial. So it's relatively easy to check if you wonder about a particular individual. And then, if you find somebody who may be the person you're looking for, then again, they are recorded, like all the service casualties, listed on the Commonwealth War Grave Commission on their main and very large database. And it's not very obvious until you get into it a little bit, but actually they were treated just the same way as the military casualties. And it's available online and not that difficult to use, although I do have troubles with the latest version. Please be aware, though, before you start looking at some of these records of wartime casualties, they really can bring tears to the eyes. Unrelated to BSA casualties, but on the memorial here, we have Marburg S, just a simple name. But this plain statement really hides a very sad story. Here is the Commonwealth War Grave Commission record for S. Marburg, aged 5, a Czech refugee. Suzanne had been put on one of the kinder transport trains out of Czechoslovakia by her parents, just as the Germans were invading, about 2 years before. She arrived in Birmingham. She was fostered by Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd of Swanshurst Lane in Moseley, just north of Moseley. Sorry, just south of Moseley Park, Swanshurst Park. An area nowhere near industry, but a stray or dump bomb landed on that house on the 11th of December 1940, and they were all killed. She, together with her foster parents, was buried in one of the cemeteries. The Hall of Memory and the local studies library has lists that will take you to them. Her mother survived the war in Czechoslovakia, and after the war she visited Birmingham and was able to visit the grave and indeed to express thanks to some people in Birmingham who remembered her and the Lloyds. But what a sad outcome for a family's attempt to take her to safety. It's certainly an aspect of war which we'd not forget, whilst also recognising the amazing efforts that were made to maintain production towards victory in 1945. I'm very grateful to a friend in Moseley, and Ian is here tonight, who very kindly, knowing my employment at BSA and that I was working on wartime casualties, lent me his copy of this book. I was totally unaware of the existence of this book. No doubt copies exist in the local studies library. So there we have it. I hope you found this account of interest in showing very considerable efforts which was put into dealing with a very difficult situation where the country was desperate for weapons needed for defence. I found it most interesting when compared with the difficulties the company had when it was contracting in the 1960s and 70s in the face of foreign competition and ever-increasing safety regulations. So, there we are, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
All right. As usual, we have an opportunity for questions. I will bring this roving microphone to you if you wave your arm, because it helps people to hear, particularly if we were managing to broadcast on Zoom to people at home. But we are making a recording of this, so it's important that people can hear. So I can see one over there, so let's start with that.
Thank you for that. Very interesting. 3 questions, if I may. First question, the names of the guns, were they made under license by BSA, like Hispano Suiza? I can't imagine that was dreamt up at Small Heath. So that, and the Browning, were they licensed, made under license by BSA, or were they invented and named by BSA? Second question, did they make the ammunition, or was the ammunition made by others? And the final question, BSA features quite extensively in the Peaky Blinders, and I was just wondering whether you thought that was a fair representation.
Right, okay. Firstly, since none of the weapons seem to have been designed specifically by firms working in Germany, I imagine that there were suitable arrangements for licensed production. Obviously, with things like the Brownings, the American weapons designs, Lewis guns as well. Hispano and Oerlikon, initially arrangements were made, and there were 1 or 2 epic accounts where production equipment in countries that were being overrun by the Germans were snuck out, where teams from the UK were sent over there to extract the tooling and the gauges and so on needed to push them into production in this country. So that was the first question. I'm not aware of BSA making ammunition. But there were other firms in Birmingham and elsewhere that were certainly manufacturing ammunition. And your third question was?
Peaky Blinders.
Well, since it's very difficult to admit this, I have very selected viewing habits. I've never seen any of it. So I can't tell you. Sorry? It's referenced extensively. Yeah, well, no, I just, don't twig to it.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Going back to those shadow factories, notably you mentioned the Redditch shadow factory and the Shirley, and then you produced that map with all the lines coming out from Small Heath. Were all those factories there, were they all shadow factories?
No. Almost all of the rest of them weren't shadow factories as such. An awful lot of them were factories taken into use by BSA, where they were either they had spare capacity, or even that they were empty, or where they were making non-strategic things which could be quietly bumped out of the way. There would certainly have been some, and my father for many, many years, indeed I worked there as well, not so much shadow factories as an aircraft hangar, or 2 or 3 aircraft of the absolutely standard aircraft hangar dumped down in a piece of ground and became a factory. So but they were not set up under the original arrangements for shadow factories. The idea partly with a shadow factory was that it was put in by a mixture of government funding and a company being given assistance to build a factory initially for their own use, for non-strategic stuff. And then when the war came along, they would expand into wartime production.
So the majority of those were like sort of in partnership with the Small Heath factory.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Jim. That's really interesting. Something that sort of rang a bell when you were talking about machine guns on aircraft, particularly the sort of the aircraft like the Spitfire, where the pilot would be sitting in the middle of the plane and he would have a machine gun, which I heard somewhere that the firing rate was synchronized with the propeller, because it went through it would have hit it if it hadn't been. Is this anything you've come across?
The main thing with the synchronized, it could be done, but it was particularly important in the First World War, synchronized machine guns, because the machine guns tended to jam quite a lot. They weren't made to the same accurate standards as later. And therefore you needed the gun to be within arm's reach of the pilot. And since he was sitting behind the engine, they needed to be able to fire through the propeller. An awful lot of the Second World War ones, the guns are mounted in the wings, but they're further out. And so it's not a matter of synchronizing. But had they needed to, then it could have been done. But aircraft engines had changed the speed that they operated at and so on. Actually, synchronizing the gun with the engine speed, you did, if you weren't careful, you finish up with sort of tail wag the dog principle. But yeah, I mean, when they got 8 machine guns, then you didn't fire them for very long. Even with the 303 machine gun, you were using ammunition at a fair old pounds per second.
Dr. Andrew, you said that in 1935 the directors had a tour of Germany and came back with the conclusion that there was going to be a war.
Sorry?
That there was going to be a war. They came back in 1935. And some of this preparation must have been going on, building factories, shadow factories, before 1939, presumably. So it was fairly obvious to a lot of people that a war was on its way. But that doesn't seem to be reflected in the history that I've been told, where complete ignorance sort of prevailed.
Yeah, it gets a bit complicated. For example, quite regularly there's reference to the Castle Bromwich factory producing Spitfires as though they were used in the Battle of Britain. There wasn't a single Spitfire from Castle Bromwich in the Battle of Britain because they didn't go into production until after the Battle of Britain. And namely the shadow factories on the charts there, you'd see 1941, 1942 for when these things came into production. Fortunately, the initial shadow factory arrangement with places like the motor industry, where a factory was set up as much as anything with the expectation of it being taken into wartime production, but set up initially making a a civilian product from the 1938-39, and then they would convert over. But they didn't sort of spring up overnight, and they took a good deal of sorting out. But certainly the implication of what's in the BSA book is that the senior management came back 1937-38 and said there's going to be a war, looked at their funding and started to fund production equipment which would come in. And if you look at the aircraft industry, you'll find the same going on, where they would develop, the company would develop another fighter or an improved fighter pre-war in anticipation of contracts coming through. And I think there's a whole area of research still to be done on some of the effort that was put in to not things like the Stain gun, which went into production, but things which didn't go into production, but which were a jolly good idea as a backup. And the one I like is the Miles M20. Miles, who made the Miles Magister and so on training aircraft, were asked if they could produce a fighter when they were frightened about the production of Hurricanes and Spitfires. And Hurricanes and Spitfires, the Spitfire was a thoroughbred, and in many ways a rather bugger to build. The Hurricane was rather easier to build because it used much more of existing technology. But they were worried, and so Miles were asked if they could produce a fighter with decent performance using the Merlin engine and the Browning 8-gun pack. And they produced a thing called Miles M20, and a few of them were built. They had a fixed undercarriage, made life simpler. But according to the RAF Flying Review, and this dates back from when I was at school, that Miles M20 had a top speed roughly between the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Carried the same machine gun pack, and I don't know why, but it had a much better range than either of those fighters. But it was not produced to the same battle-worthy conditions and so on as you would want for a mainline fighter. So it didn't go into production.
Jim, thank you very much for that. Are there actually any remains of the BSA factories anywhere?
I don't know, I've not looked.
Thank you.
There are bits. If you know the Small Heath works, for example, there were a number of highly identifiable bits in there, some of which may still be producing BSA stuff, BSA guns. Yeah. A bit like BSA machine tools. I don't know if they're still in production now, but I went round them on a visit from the IMechE not so long ago. They're still at Macadam Lane. There's about 30 guys doing very, very specialist machine tool manufacture. Bespoke machine tool manufacture at a very high level. And a lovely little unit that we went round and obviously knew what they were doing and doing it very well. But contracted from a factory which had had 1,000, 1,500 employees in the early 60s. When I went round them, because I thought about going into the machine tool industry. And in fact, by the time I joined BSA, they sold the machine tool bit anyway, went to Alfred Herbert's. But yeah, so you get some little bits and pieces around the place. And I must try and discover for sure just where the Shirley Works is. I think I know where it was, and I think it's housing now. Uh,
It's on the old TRW side.
sorry?
On the old TRW side.
Don't know.
Was it the predecessor of that site?
Ah,
Is it BSA Lucas, then TRW in their houses?
yeah.
Dog Kennel Lane?
Yeah, I think so.
Ah.
If you won't see it, you won't.
No, not there won't be anything left.
Houses on the other side of Dog Kennel Lane there.
Yeah.
No dogs.
No dogs either,
Just ask you to explain your history with BSA. Yes, a potted summary of your career at BSA.
Sorry?
Could you give me a potted history of your career at BSA?
Oh dear. Right. I joined from Imperial College London, came for an interview when I was coming up to, well, in the March, no, in April actually, in April 65.
As an engineer?
Hmm?
As a qualified engineer?
Yeah, at that stage I was about to qualify as a mechanical engineer. And I had interviews with BSA and with where mine's gone blank, isn't it? Another company in Birmingham. And the college had managed to arrange them end on. I was absolutely skint. I'd met, who's now my wife, 4 months before. We were getting on very well. But to the stage at which she lived up in Yorkshire, and suddenly here was this opportunity. I could afford the fare up to Yorkshire, and so Tube Investments, Tube Investment said they might like to take me on the following year, but they wouldn't give me a guarantee to allow me to go back and do a master's degree, which I'd already signed up for. BSA said yes, they would. Wouldn't give me any funding towards it, but at the end of the year, they gave me the increment as though I'd joined them just at the initial graduate. So, and that was 100 a year. So I moved from the 1,000 to being paid 1,100 a year. Wow. The other thing was that I met my wife's family a week before her father died, and I offered to go up to the funeral. Thank goodness it worked out. So we've been married 56 years now. Okay, so I was recruited into them at that stage. In 1966, I'd finished my master's. I put in my dissertation, rang the company and said, I'm supposed to be starting with you in 2 weeks' time. I better come up next week and see you. Came up. Never been, but that was my second visit to Birmingham. I've never been to Birmingham, so I went for an interview. We got sorted out, and I would go initially onto the graduate training scheme, where once a month all the graduate intake would meet together. And the graduate training scheme was not just for university graduates, it was for equal numbers of university graduates and guys who were time served 2 years after they finished their apprenticeship, so the same age. And by that time, they might be working as a deputy foreman or something like that. And it was jolly good because it mixed them up. And we went all around the bits of the works, seeing what was going on, meeting together, and we were treated very well. That's small. Well, the others, we would go out to visit the other places. Initially you started off in 1 or 2 sections, and then if you clicked, you'd stay with that section. So I stayed with development engineering, had a bit of time at the Redditch works, came off that to a post as a development engineer after about eight months on the training scheme at Small Heath. and I worked there as development engineer on the 3-cylinder triples, the 750 750 3-cylinder ones, the BSA rocket and the Trident, and also on the Ariel 3. And it's one of those strange things. The Ariel 3 we've got in the collection came into the collection because I knew what the Ariel 3 story was, and that it just melted. It was just hopeless. And the reason was BSA, one of their problems was that they would come up with a market research report that said this will sell. This would sell at £97. And when they started trying to test them, they were flopping all over the place. And the price crept up to £130, but the company never went back to look at the market research detail. They then launched them and they pancaked. At the end of that, they sold the remaining stock at 97 quid, the original price. And the one we've got in the collection here came to us from a couple who were devoted to it. He'd bought it for his wife to go for shopping. It was so stable, it was everything else, did just what they wanted. And they managed to keep it going and going and going by scrounging bits and finding where they could get bits and so on. And finally, they couldn't keep it going, and they came to the museum, not quite in tears, but not far off, to say, was there any way the museum would be interested in this Poxley three-wheeler? Oh yeah, and we'll get there eventually, don't worry. You're trying to jump ahead. So I'm jumping ahead on this motorcycle. So because I knew the story of it, and there was a lovely example, so I was able to write that up. And it's a useful example to use if you get your marketing wrong, but it justified the original marketing because somebody had bought it for just what it was meant for, and they were so delighted. So I worked on those things. Then they're setting up Umberslade Hall, and I was put on to the sort of project team looking at kitting out the workshops that were going to be built at Umberslade Hall for motorcycle development testing. And we put in a series of test cells where we could run engines and so on. And so I worked there on that until, as it got into operation, I was offered a job as a data evaluation engineer, which took an awful lot to explain to anybody. One of the things BSA had found, it was a bit of a problem. The guys doing the development testing were great on testing things out, but they were bloody hopeless at writing down what they'd done. So my job was to produce a decent report of everything that's been done and go back. I went back through 4 or 5 years of development test reports that they'd got, reworking them to provide a consistent story. And so I was in that for a while, and then the guy who was chief standards engineer retired, and they offered me the post. So I moved into being chief standards engineer. The main BSA weren't interested in standards. Dreadful. But the reason I was accepted throughout the place wasn't because I was doing standards. I was doing vehicle legislation. And they knew that vehicle legislation would cripple them if they didn't get it right. And that a lot of folks weren't going to balk at anybody sorting that out because they didn't have to be a motorcyclist. I've had a motorcycle ride to discover how do you get reverse? Little things. You know. So that was where I finished up at Umberslade Hall as chief standards engineer with a small team.
72, 73.
Sorry?
Well, that would be 1972, 73.
Yeah, that sort of time. And then when in 71, 72, of course, they hit the buffers again, and I was, with others, was moved across to, in fact, my staff were made redundant. I was moved across to a corner of a workshop, of a drawing office in Meriden, and continued. By this time I was dealing with all the vehicle legislation, and I was travelling around meetings in Europe, and even in theory I was going to appear at a court case in the States. I got out there, but they settled out of court before I had to drop the company in it. But all useful experience. And then it was getting worse and worse. There were 2 years of about to be made redundant. And I was applying for various jobs just to get out. And eventually I, on a very dubious circumstances, got the job in Birmingham City Council as a pollution inspector. I moved there, and the joy of joys, of course, I moved there as pollution inspector. Meanwhile, the rump of the technical units I'd been with were moved back to Macadam Lane. So I was then going in to meet my colleagues, but as the local authority inspector, seeing how things were. And then in due course, I spotted a job at the museum. How many people do you know who found the job which they spent the rest of their life doing by reading it from the bottom up? The council's vacancies, and there was a great thick wodge, would come out, and I was at Rickery Park out in the sticks, and it never reached us in time. And it was a joke. You know, it would land thwack on your desk. There we are. There's a job there that you can find that's still in date. And so I flicked, I reached to flick it. And there was one, as I flicked it, the closing date hadn't closed yet. And it turned out to be this job at the museum.
At Neal Street?
Yeah, yes. And even that, they weren't going to interview me, but that's another story. So I moved sideways.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Have we? All to tears.
We had a good discussion anyway, so right. Well, I think we've learnt a great deal tonight about an interesting subject, history of an interesting company, and a very important time in its history. So, and very interesting about some of those products it was making. So let's thank Dr. Andrew in the usual way with a good round of applause. Okay.